All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of BeaverCon. Hope everyone had a great evening last night and got out to the Rayback Collective or otherwise explored Boulder. I just want to give a shout out at the top of today to all of our sponsors. This event would not be happening at the scale and scope that it is without them. So please visit them and learn about the great work that all these sponsors are doing. And they really are enveloping and holding this room in a hug-like fashion surrounding us. So thank you to all of you for making this event so special. I also want to note, I know it's on the schedule, but there are posters over there and a poster session, so feel free to go and talk to folks and learn about their work via the posters. And then just another reminder about the storytelling circle tonight, just RSVP on the Whova. There is a max capacity of 120, and that is going to be at the Dairy Arts Center, so just another reminder about that. And otherwise, now I'm going to introduce you to your MC for this morning, Rachel Siegel of the Illinois Beaver Alliance, and also a steering committee member of the conference, and the co-chair of the National Beaver Working Group, the funding working group. So she wears so many hats, and the one she's going to wear this morning is MC. So without further ado, Rachel.
Good morning. I'm excited to be emceeing Tuesday morning's event in the main ballroom. Just a quick reminder that we're not going to be giving full bios, so you can see people's bios in the app, and also put your questions for Q&A in the app as well. I am very happy to be introducing Janine Castro, Technical Director, River Restoration Professional Certificate Program with Portland State University's Environmental Professional Program. She will be speaking on landscape restoration gaps. Come on up.
Over the duration of my 35-year career, it's a little scary to say that, restoration projects have gone from the small site scale, a few hundred feet of stream bank restoration or stabilization, to landscape scale, miles of stream, thousands of acres. I never thought that I would see this in my career, and it's fantastic. And it's providing a really great foundation for the work that we're doing with beaver restoration, because it's creating these habitat patches that are just critical for the work that we're all trying to do. But we've created these habitat patches, these thousands of acres or hundreds of acres that are really ideal beaver habitat. But how do the beaver get there? Well, as Emily said yesterday, they go by airplane. We'll just drop them in. It seems like an efficient way to do things. And as she mentioned as well, it didn't happen just in Idaho, which is such a great story, and it really gets the public interested. It was happening in California. And many of you in this room, and you'll hear more about this later today, do translocation, relocating beaver. But there's kind of a dark side to translocation. And I know we've talked a bit about it, but I think it's something that we have to recognize. There can be very high mortality associated with translocation. And it sounds like a lot of you have worked hard, you have the facilities, you have the experience to kind of reduce mortality rates, but it's a lot of work. And it's great that you're all doing this, but it's not something I would encourage people who don't have that kind of experience to do. So that's why I want to talk today about beaver recolonization. For those of us who maybe we don't have the facilities and we can't move beaver or we can't get a permit, but what if we looked at these strongholds of beaver and said, well, can we help them get to other places on their own? And that's what I really want to talk about, minding the gap between these habitat patches. But I want to start with a story. And kind of my first experience with beaver, really, in my professional career. And this is McCoy Creek in Northeast Oregon. And McCoy Creek is kind of my first big restoration project. So 1,000 acres, a couple miles of stream. And I think our first big restoration project, it's kind of like your first love, right? You'll never forget it. and you might follow them on Facebook. So I have followed McCoy Creek for years, because when I was out there working on a channel reconstruction project, there was a beaver complex, and I didn't think much about it. But I have this visceral kind of memory of being out there during a survey in the winter, freezing cold, ice over the beaver ponds, and we're walking, and it's cracking, and we can hear it cracking under our feet. And once in a while, you hear this like big sploosh, and someone would drop through, and it was only a few feet of water, but it was cold. So that's my memory of McCoy Creek. And McCoy Creek, as I mentioned, is in the Upper Grand Run watershed in Northeast Oregon, just to get you oriented, because I'm going to show you a few more pictures. And if we look at McCoy Creek, it suffered the same fate as so many of our western streams in particular, but really all over the country, all over the world. It was straightened in the 1960s to provide more grazing land for cattle. And it stayed that way for a long time, even after the cattle were removed. And beaver were coming and going, but they couldn't really persist. And a lot of that is because of elk, but I'm not going to tell that story today. The lower end is where the beaver complex was. And the next picture I'm going to show you is in the upper part, so above the road. This is an area, and this is where we kind of started doing the restoration project. So if we zoom in, you can see from this picture that it had been straightened, but there was a historical channel. So the great thing is it was my first opportunity to design and implement an engineered log jam. So a big log jam went in, we shunted the water into the historical channel. And the reason I show this is because not only was it, I think, quite a successful restoration project, but it opened my eyes to biology. So I'm a geomorphologist by training. I studied water and sediment. I didn't really think about biology. It's like, well, that comes in later. It's someone else's job. It's not mine. But the vegetation really messed up my sediment transport calculations. It's really annoying. So this is where I started thinking about biology and how important it is. And so for those of you who've heard me speak before, maybe you've read the Stream Evolution Triangle paper that I wrote with Colin Thorne, this is what started my thinking about biology and how important it is in stream restoration and just in streams more generally. So if we zoom back out, we actually did restore this kind of entire meadow area. Well, we tried to restore it. And McCoy Creek is great because it went through literally every iteration of restoration techniques. So single thread meandering channel, pond and plug, then we added side channels. We put in some large wood. We tried all kinds of things. Not me personally, but there were a number of folks who came after me. But if you look at this meadow, it's still kind of dry. It's still the beaver come and go. So the next phase of restoration on McCoy will be a more full floodplain reconnection. So we'll see how that goes. But this is still a really valuable habitat patch. And if we zoom kind of out and go downstream, this is the Grand Ronde River, and this is Bird Track Springs, a restoration project by the Bureau of Reclamation that just went in. Again, thousands of feet of stream channel, hundreds of acres of floodplain reconnection. And you look at that and think, some pretty good beaver habitat there. Maybe in the side channels, perhaps not in the main channel. And then I started thinking, well, I've got this patch, I've got the patch upstream, but how do the beaver get between the two? How far can beaver migrate? How far do they disperse? And are there patches in between? And then I came up with this new term the other day. I was super excited because everybody has like BDA. I haven't come up with a really cool term. So someone was telling me that in holding facilities, sometimes they use those like igloo-looking dog things that beaver can stay in. I'm like, beaver bunkers. That's it. That's going to be mine. Can we create beaver bunkers along the way? Do we need to provide some habitat to increase survival, to provide a corridor, a safe migration corridor for beaver? So in my world, in fisheries, we think about fish passage a lot, and fish passage barriers and corridors. And that's what got me thinking about migration corridors for beaver. And in the Grand Ronde watershed, we are very lucky because the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation have a lot of projects. These are just their projects, not including Bureau of Reclamation and all the other folks. So we are in a really great position where we have enough restoration projects on the landscape in many places to start connecting the dots. So I am here today to advocate for small projects, which may sound the exact opposite of what I just said. But big habitat patches need to be connected. And how do we do that? And it's a really simple conceptual model. You've got 2 habitat patches, you've got a gap in between, and you fill the gap with a stepping stone. And maybe that's a deep pool, it might be some cover, it might be a BDA. And eventually, as we restore these corridors, hopefully it evolves over time and provides much more safe passage. So when I started reading the literature around beaver migration, there were quite a few papers like this, which were really interesting to see how far beaver move between beaver complexes, which tends to be like hundreds of meters. And you'll see these complexes where the beaver are moving all the time. And there's quite a few papers, and it was really interesting reading about that. And this I just put in because I thought it was absolutely fascinating. So if you look at how far, and this again, just one study, you look how far beaver will move from their home lodge. If they move 100 meters, their travel speed is about 100 meters an hour. If they go 400 meters from their lodge, they move at about 400 meters per hour. It's kind of a one-to-one line. I'm like, I know what this is. This is the beaver commute distance. Beavers only commute an hour away from home, just like us. I think that makes perfect sense. So we have this idea of how big these patches might need to be for foraging, for building materials. But I want to know, when those 2-year-olds are ready to disperse, how far can they go? And do they have a way to move away from their home lodge? So thank you to Emily Fairfax. She kind of put me onto this study, which is back from 2000. And it was really looking at dispersal distances. So this is like, okay, so there's a difference between males and females, but they might move 5 kilometers from home, or maybe 10, and then you get some just adventurous females out there that move more than 20 kilometers. What I didn't come across, and it may be in the literature, what are the mortality rates for dispersal? So recolonization, this is something we can all be doing. But I don't know if there are many studies out there really looking at mortality rates associated with dispersal, and I think that's an area that could use some work. So as I was thinking about this idea of stepping stones, I will admit, I gave a talk about this related to juvenile salmon because I work on the Expert Regional Technical Group, my co-authors on this paper, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But I was looking up information on stepping stones, and I came across this paper by Wang and others in 2023, and it's about monkeys in China. Monkey migration. I'm like, well, this is kind of cool. So I was reading this paper, and basically they said, we need corridors for monkey migration. It will cost billions of dollars. We can't afford to do that. So they came up with this model to improve monkey migration. And you know what? It works for a lot of other things as well. So you start with this idea of 2 habitat patches, maybe strongholds, they're sustainable, and maybe you've got some natural stepping stones between. You find those gaps. We would add additional stepping stones in those critical gaps, and then you start creating these weak connections, those yellow lines. Over time, as we do more restoration work, maybe we get more flow in the stream. We start strengthening those connections. And as we get synergy between stepping stones, that synergy can create a smaller habitat patch. And then ideally, over time, you'll see that patch form into a more kind of sustainable stronghold. And this is how I think we can really start building more resilience into these beaver populations. So I thought it was a really great conceptual model. So now I want to introduce my co-authors, the Expert Regional Technical Group. We are a group of geomorphologists, stream ecologists, fisheries biologists, and we score big habitat projects in the Columbia River estuary, the lower 150 miles of the Columbia River, from Bonneville Dam down to the ocean. And we exist for a very specific reason, to increase juvenile salmon survival in the estuary. All the salmon from the Columbia Basin are coming through the estuary. So that is what we are tasked with. Historical conditions of floodplain and tidal marsh habitat, we have lost 68% of it. And this is catastrophic for our fish and many other species. So we are kind of scoring these projects to figure out, how much benefit it will have. Now, what we used to do is we would score just on the site scale. And I want to show you an example of a very small project in our terms, this little red dot over there, just down from Bonneville Dam, called the Shire. And the Shire is only 15 acres. And you might think, well, that's pretty big. But the Shire has to compete against a project that's 1,200 acres. So they're all competing for funding, right, in the estuary. And for many years, our group just evaluated projects on the site scale, that habitat patch. So how much cover is there? How many channels? Do we have large wood at the site? Do the fish have access? So we went through and scored a lot of projects. And the Shire, quite frankly, it wouldn't do very well. It provides some floodplain habitat, but they actually have to excavate a channel because the flows in the Columbia River are lower, so it's not being accessed all the time. So again, it has to compete. This is a small project competing against a large project. And about 5 years ago, we started looking at things at the landscape scale. And this is where connectivity and stepping stones become very important. So if we think of our channels, our straightened, simplified channels, as Ellen Wool mentioned, they don't provide much habitat, high mortality. And it's not just for fish, it's for other things as well. It's high mortality for beaver. There's just nothing there. They're just trying to move through and survive. And sometimes these stretches are long enough, they're just not going to survive. So we started by focusing on tributary junctions. Tributary junctions have high biodiversity. They have more potential because you've got inputs coming in. They tend to be depositional. We focused on tributary junctions. Then after that, that's where we really started thinking about stepping stones. If your tributaries are 3 kilometers apart, maybe that's too far. Maybe we need something in the middle. So we started thinking about stepping stones and eventually having this more mature kind of river corridor. I think that's really what we're trying to accomplish, is having that more mature river corridor. Safer passage for fish, for beaver, and for lots of other aquatic species. So let's go back to the Shire. If you look at that little red blob, that's the Shire, just downstream Bonneville Dam. It's competing against Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge, $35 million project, 1,200 acres, setting back a core levee. It was a big project, and it got a lot of attention. Poor Shire sitting there like, hey, what about me? I'm pretty important too. And when we scored the Shire based on landscape, it was incredibly important. Now all of a sudden, this little project that wasn't going to cost much money, but we thought, it doesn't have a lot of benefit, it's critical. And I think for many of us who work in restoration, our work is opportunistic. We need a landowner who's going to cooperate with us, or we need federal land or state land. And sometimes it's just not in the right place. But can we focus our efforts by finding these areas that need stepping stones and really make a concerted effort to fill those gaps? So the Shire is filling basically about a 25, 30 kilometer gap. We still have a big gap downstream. But little juvenile salmon don't really cross over the Columbia River, so we're looking on that north shore of the Columbia. And I think we've shown success. In the Columbia River estuary, and if you want to see more information, there's a QR code there. We have over 90 projects, over 9,000 acres restored, and this is the part that I find remarkable. 17% of the recoverable floodplain area has been restored. And what we mean by that is when we look at all that lost habitat, that 68%, we call it recoverable if it doesn't have a city sitting on it or if it doesn't have a railroad or a highway. So this is private lands, agricultural lands, behind levees, behind tide gates. we've restored 17%, and I think that is a message of hope. We can do this. We have a lot of projects out there. So let's work with that. Let's get some synergy, and let's kind of fight for those smaller projects that maybe don't have enough funding. So I'm going to leave you with kind of 6 steps to restoring and supporting recolonization. Identifying those habitat patches. Where are your strongholds? I think wherever you're working, you probably have a pretty good sense. And maybe you should just putting that on a map. Kind of assessing the connectivity. Do you already have good connectivity? Are beaver able to move? And this is my question, is how far do beaver move when they're dispersing? And I'm sure that varies a lot depending on where you are in the country, what your kind of streams look like, but I think that's something we need to get a handle on. Design stepping stones to link those sustainable habitats, evaluating these corridors to kind of support those stable connections, linking adjacent stepping stones, as I mentioned before, and finally, establishing new habitat patches. I think that really is our ultimate goal. So let me leave you with this thought. We as a restoration community mature and our restoration projects mature, remember that small projects can be mighty and that we really all need to mind the gap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janine.
By the way, you should play this game. It is so fun. You really do need someone in every generation, though, or you're going to get stuck. Like millennial stuff, forget it. I was like, we're never moving off this spot.
All right, Janine, we got 3 minutes to ask a couple of questions, and there are a few in the Q&A. Would you say that for areas that don't currently have beavers, that BDAs occupy the designation of these stepping stones you speak of? And for how many years should you be developing these stepping stones before you attempt beaver relocation?
Oh, that is a great question. So I really was focused on recolonization, on the beaver moving on their own. I would say BDAs absolutely can be your stepping stone. We know that we have to go back in and maintain these structures because if the beaver aren't there doing it for us. But if you've identified a critical location, and maybe it just takes 3 or 4 BDAs to provide some habitat, to provide deeper water, I think that's a really good approach. And then ideally, if you are getting beaver migration through that area, I'm looking at Emily as I'm saying this, hopefully the beaver will then be able to kind of start creating some of their own habitat and reinforcing. But I think it would require going back and kind of keeping an eye on those BDAs.
Okay, great. What if we're planning for adjacent colonies? How should we think about them interacting?
Ooh, adjacent colonies. That's a good question for a biologist.
Excellent. And just to tie into part of your answer to the first question, can you speak to the maintenance of structures over the years and how many years until the ecosystem was considered self-sustaining?
Oh, that question is incredibly variable depending on where you're at, depending on if the beaver kind of come into that area. And sometimes we're doing BDAs knowing that beaver aren't going to be there, and we're trying to kind of mimic the hydraulic conditions. Now, this is something I want to mention because we've talked in depth about this with the expert regional technical group. This expectation that I'm going to go build a beaver dam analog, and somehow the beaver are going to think it's good enough, and they're going to just come use the dam. And I've heard people say, the beaver didn't use your BDA, it was a failure. I'm like, whoa, that was not the intention of the BDA. The BDA was to maybe slow the water down, spread it out, change the hydraulics, and provide kind of the opportunity for beaver to get established. But it certainly was not with the intention of that a beaver would come live at my BDA. I mean, come on, we're just not that good. They might build a BDA 10 feet, or their beaver dam 10 feet from our BDA, but I don't know, has anybody had the experience that they built a BDA and the beaver were like, yes, this is perfect? One? You have one. All right, great, we got a few. So call that, you got really lucky, but don't expect it. Do not set yourself up as that's your success criteria.
All right, well, that's the end of this session. We have a little bit of a passing period. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Thank you.